In the world of summer camp, staff members come and go every year. How can we make these transitions both positive and productive? Join us and our guest, Colette Marquardt, Executive Director of ACA Illinois, to find out.
Imagine camp registration software that actually gives you more time to do what you love. With UltraCamp, you can effortlessly track attendance, manage staff, streamline registration, and more. Explore now at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode.
Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Go Camp Pro. After 10 years of podcasting, is there anything left to say? You bet. Because just like people grow and change, so does our industry. Each and every year, there are new challenges, new ways of handling situations, new advice from those doing the work, and new ideas to share. Our commitment to intentional leadership training has only grown stronger. Join us for season 11 of Camp Code as we once again do all that we can to help you develop your best ever leadership training. And welcome, everybody. I am so excited for today's podcast. I have the honor of interviewing a woman I admire so much. She is incredibly smart and thoughtful and extremely intentional in the work that she does. So naturally, we at Camp Code would love to pick her brain and share with you some of the knowledge that she's gained over her career. So I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'm going to give Colette an opportunity to do the same. So I'm Beth Allison. I'm co-owner of Camp Hacker and Go Camp Pro, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a camp consultant and a trainer who eats, sleeps, and breathes intentional leadership training. I'm all about building solid and supportive community because that's where it all begins and how all potential is reached. All right. And Colette, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, thank you for the very kind words and introduction, Beth. You are also somebody that I admire and look up to. Again, my name is Colette. I use pronouns she, her, and I am the executive here at ACA Illinois, which is an independent affiliate of the national organization. And I work primarily with hundreds of camps throughout not just Illinois, but the region, the Midwest region, and throughout the country to help strengthen camps as workplaces and also places for kids to have great experiences. So, all around looking at the industry as a whole.
Excellent. And I can't wait to dive in. So, as we've told you the first couple of episodes this season, you're going to have an opportunity to hear from your usual co host, Gabs, Ruby, and me, although not necessarily all at the same time, like today, and from special guests that we've lined up to share their wisdom with us. And today is one of those special days. So, Colette, again, it's a privilege to have you here. I have known Colette for a number of years, first through the Mid States Conference, and then, of course, as one of the co-founders of the Women in Camp Summit. I get to work with her, and it's quite frequently these days as we gear up for our first in-person summit in 4 years this December. So thanks, Colette, for being here today and for sharing some of your brilliance. I know you are a very busy lady. I know this for an absolute fact. So we're going to just dive in. Okay, so I know that you've done a lot of thinking about this particular topic as a former camp director and now as an executive director. And we know that camp is a very fluid place when it comes to staffing, just by the very nature of it. We have huge staff turnovers over the years, and sometimes even in the middle of a season or halfway through leadership training. And although summer camps do their best to treat staff like family, we do have to remember that there are best practices that we need to use when people choose to leave, or we have to ask them to, or when we ourselves leave an organization. So we're going to start with this question, Colette. What do you consider a productive transition when an employee leaves?
That's a very good question. So something that I really started to notice at a different level throughout the pandemic as we were seeing a lot of turnover for various reasons, right? Whether it's because, people were losing their jobs, both year-round employees and seasonally, in
Mhm.
layoffs, or whether it was performance-based, or people found other jobs and moved and changed, right? So it was happening, as well as all of the conversation around kind of what's happening in the workforce. And what I started to recognize was also kind of my own experiences, both as an employee, but also as a manager, in times when I look back and I'm like, I cringe at the way I handled some of those transitions as an employer. I'm like, ooh,
Yeah, I
that
could say the
wasn't,
same for myself.
yeah. And then it started to occur to me, like, we don't really talk about it and we're not really trained in it, right? Like, we can get trained in the very legal aspects, right? We'll talk about like what is the legal things we have to do for people to leave, or to transition out, as I call it. Like whether it's on your own, you decide, or your employer decides, or if you're an employer, your employee decides, or you decide. And so then looking at what's productive versus what's, maybe toxic. And what I see as productive, like a productive transition, is one that, causes the least amount of disruption, both culturally and logistically to your organization. So,
Okay.
are you prepared for that? Versus a toxic transition, which creates, right, a lot of like upheaval. And I think, many of us can probably reflect back on times we were part of a toxic transition, whether we're the employees kind of left behind in it, um, versus, the productive transition that people kind of come through it still feeling empowered by those that are still at that employer. As a manager, you're feeling in control of what's happening. And I don't mean in a, you know, very top down control, but like, okay, I know what's happening. I know what needs to be done. I've got my people to help support this. I'm providing the right support to other people. I have my own support. Or versus the like, oh, so and so's leaving, everything is gone awry. There's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of conflict, right? There's a lot of negative things being said and a lot of like speculation, right?
Hmm.
We've had those
Yep.
experiences. Those are what I would deem as like toxic, right? Because it just fuels things happening, as opposed to just being like, okay, these are going to happen, which because I think that we don't tend to think about transitions from a place of like it's just what happens, um,
Mm,
because there can be a lot of shame around it for the employers or the managers, right? The camp directors, like, you don't want your staff to want to leave. You don't want to be the person that has to say I had to let go or fire people for performance, right? Like, because it's like, oh well, what did you do wrong?
hmm.
um, as employees, we don't tend to like, we're not really taught how to navigate that too. But the reality is, like you said, employee transitions happen. Employment is a transaction. I'm a very mission focused person. This is not something that it's very natural to me to be like, it's a transaction, but it is, right? I'm paying my employees, they're doing a service, it's this transaction. And that when we start to understand that it's just another part of our operations we have to be prepared for and know what's going to happen, just like a rainy day at camp, versus always being reactive. Because I when I was a camp director, I was always very reactive to it.
And it's hard not to take it so personally either way,
Yes.
right? Like either you, as you said, you've either failed as the director in your mind,
Hmm.
um, or your heart, because we hire these people, and camp is one of those places where we become a family. I mean, that's our goal, right? We want to
Right.
become that family. So you hate to let someone go. I was famous for giving many second chances that possibly I
Same.
should not have given all of them, now that I think back on it.
Same.
Um, but also that you just feel there's more feeling in it than the transaction piece. So I love that when it's, yes, they are providing a service and we are providing employment and payment for that service. We kind of have to think about that. So you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I don't know if you can dive into it a bit further. But
Mhm.
why is it so important to sort of think about this and reflect on this ahead of time? Like you said, you didn't want to be reactive, but what other things can sort of come out of that thinking and reflecting on productive versus toxic
Yeah.
now?
So when you're proactive and knowing that you're gonna have these transitions, because we're going to have them, right? Because nobody, and we don't want to the camp industry does not want to be the employer that everybody's beholden to, right? Because that's that's not what we're trying to do, as you said, like trying to build community and a sense of belonging. And so
Mm-hmm.
with that has to come a level of choice of participation. So when we're thinking about it, one of the key reasons why it's so important to be productive about it is it allows us, especially the leaders and the leadership, to know what's going to happen when an employee leaves, whether that's on the second day of leadership and staff training, whether that's in the middle of summer, whether that's you've got a staff member, or, if you manage year-round professionals, that you're like, right? I think every director can say they've been there where they're like, well, do I give the second chance because I want the best for this person, right? You feel very
Mm-hmm.
pulled to them, but also you're like, what am I going to do if I don't, if I lose that person, right? And so by being proactive, you're building systems to help prepare you for, a time where you're going to have a smaller workforce too, right? So things like, you know, not all the information is being held in one area, right? We know that with succession and leadership, that's often talked about, that like you don't want one person in your organization because a rainy day is going to happen. What happens if that person is out? As directors, we should always, what is the bare minimum number of people we can run camp with? And then what is the ideal number? And so if we're staffing at the bare minimum and there's not another layer, then we're already setting up our situation for a lot of toxicity, right? Because when you take out that minimum number, you've got a lot of people who are stretched, mentally, emotionally, physically, especially in the camp space, where you're just like, there's nothing else I can do. Then you start to see the burnout rates increase, the stress increase, our ability to respond. And that trickles down to the type of experience we can provide the campers. So when we're proactive, if we look at like the amount of staff we're hiring, what is that bare minimum, and making sure we have extra, people. And I often hear people like, oh yeah, and then I hire a couple extra because I know that we're going to, like, some people aren't going to last.
Yep.
I'm not talking about that, because I think that already sets up for I think that when we think about that, and I hear it all the time, and I know I've been part of that, it sets us up to have people without intentionality, as opposed to saying, okay, if let me back up. So one thing that I do frequently is any project that we have at ACA Illinois, I know the ways we're going to pivot if I lose staff members or key leadership or volunteers. And I know which things will just be like, we're just not going to do that anymore. Like maybe it was a task or a project. And if that staff member leading it is no longer with us, it's just kind of getting put into the holding pen until we hire someone else. If it's a leadership or volunteer, because we have a lot of leaders and volunteers in our organization, is there somebody else I can delegate it to, right? Knowing, and then that helps when there's those transitions to know what, to know how to react when that person can no longer serve in that role. And I would challenge camps to really think about that, like what happens if you lose a program area? Are you really prepared for that, ropes course director to leave? What happens if that, and kind of just knowing that it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. It's really easy. Like,
Yes.
we don't have to have a five binder plan. Okay. But it's like, okay, if the ropes course director is the certified person to lead the ropes course and they leave, or you need them to leave, what is your plan? Are you just going to have to shut it down, and you just know that's going to be a tough customer service thing? You're going to have to deal with that. You know it, but going in that that's an area that you just won't be able to, like, put someone else in. Or is it, here is the backup, this is what we'll do, and maybe we won't execute that backup until it happens too. Like, I don't think we always have to execute all our plan B's and C's until it happens.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
right, but the idea of like knowing kind of a little bit about what you're gonna do should something happen is also just, it's good management, right? Because things happen. Maybe that transition, like I said, is sometimes by our own choice as employees, sometimes as an employer, sometimes people get sick, sometimes there's pandemics, sometimes
What?
there's wildfires and tornadoes, and
Yeah,
right, like
right.
sometimes it's
Out
out
of
of
your
our
control.
control.
Yeah.
But knowing, and then that allows that proactive measure, like thinking through it, also will help set you up. This is why I think it's super important to like have that proactive mindset, is then when it happens, you are going to demonstrate good leadership when the time comes to the rest of your staff,
Mm,
right? Like you're not going to be standing there like, I don't know what we're going to do. And sometimes it's great to show vulnerability, but right. But I remember being, 20 in front of a camp director who's like three people, left camp over the weekend, and they were just like, I don't know what we're gonna do. And we're all like, but what does that mean for us, right? Like
right.
like we don't have, so just thinking through some of those things allows you to be like, this is what happened, and this is what we're gonna do, and be,
Uh,
confident. Does that make
Amazing.
sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. And yes, my wheels are turning. Okay. Um, yes, thank you so much. But we're going to stop for a quick break because there's more that I want to get into here, more questions I want to ask you about that specifically. But we're just going to hear from our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to hear more about productive transitions from Colette. For our Camp Code listeners, here's an exclusive offer to enhance staff retention year-round. Get UltraCamp staff communication calendar with free customizable email templates at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode. Remember what drew you to the camp experience? UltraCamp knows it wasn't for the paperwork. That's why they've created an all-in-one platform to streamline your program management. They've got powerful tools that put you in control of your information. They automate critical processes like registration and billing. They generate customized reports to gain valuable insights. You can streamline your hiring process, including integrated background checks, and you can quickly communicate with your clients and donors. UltraCamp's goal is to help their clients spend less time in the office and more time doing what they love. Want to know if UltraCamp is the right fit for you? They offer free customized demo sessions so you can see their software in action. Sign up at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode. And we are back. Okay, Colette, we have talked about so many things already, and it's just getting started. All right. So we've talked about what a productive transition is and why it's important, but I'd love if you could touch a little bit on further, because you did a little in your last explanation, but how can camps prepare for these sorts of transitions? So yes, sort of thinking through what am I going to do just in case, but are there other steps that they can take to be prepared for these sorts of things to make sure, again, we're productive and not toxic?
Yeah, so I would say one thing that a camp can do is particularly like have your own support system as a camp director. That's very important because the stress is going to fall on you when that happens, right? So your support system, you will have the help and support, of course, of your leadership team to work through this transition, but who's helping you? And so making sure that you've got that lined up, whether that's, you know, I'm a big proponent of therapy, especially when you hold a position of high leadership that comes with a lot of stress, which I would say a camp director qualifies for that, because that's going to be somebody who is on is in your corner and is focused on what you need, or outside friends and family, mentors, or another outside professional. Maybe it's a fellow camp director that you can talk to help you through that transition for what it means for you. Because oftentimes, especially in the camp world, and so many of us came up through our camps into that role, it's
Yep.
easy to want to fall into that. This is where I think the prevention of toxicity happens, is if you can show up as a leader, and you show up for your people, but then making sure that there's other people to help show up for you during that. The other thing I believe that camps can do, especially if you're part of an agency of some sort, is know what will happen during those transitions to keep them productive. So going in very clear, if you've got international staff, what does that So that logistical piece needs to be in line. Again, you might go to your HR department if you're part of a large agency, and they might be like, why are we spending so much time talking about this? Like, we'll deal with it then. But the reality is the fast pacedness of camp life
Mm-hmm.
does not allow for that in the same way as if you have a year-round employee leave in December, you're not dealing with the same kind of immediacy of how you're going
Right.
to respond. So knowing, okay, this is what's going to happen, whether it's your choice, and then knowing the two sides, right? Like, what happens if the employee wants to leave versus what happens if you need the employee to leave for whatever reason, because those two things are very different. Um, and making sure that you know and you have that. So that's the plan, to get in writing and to know this is step one, step two, who needs to know. Again, like with international and with camp staff, because it can be very, going back to that discussion about like that community, that sense of family, it can be very disruptive in the middle of summer
Very.
to
Absolutely.
just all of a sudden have your best friend, fellow camp counselor just like ripped out of the cabin, right? Like, and as a director, we know why, and there's good reasons usually why that happens. Um, if it's a camp the camp saying that that person needs to go. But how do you then, what is the step of how you're going to tell people, who tells people? I think that's really important because that also takes a layer of that mental load off of you having
Mm-hmm.
to figure out in the time of camp when you've got all these campers showing up for breakfast, right? And your cook just called out sick, for the day. They're coming back, right? But they're out sick, right? Because it's never just one crisis happens at camp, right?
No.
It's always
Yes.
it's always five things. Yeah.
And I think, like we've said on Camp Code for 10 plus seasons now, it's front load, front load, front load.
Mm-hmm.
So we always, through staff training, sat down and told our staff, here's what happens if you leave. Here's what happens if we have to ask you to leave.
Yes.
So that everybody knew the procedure and what would happen, and again, how that information would travel. So, and how it would stop. So at least you try your best to make sure that the information, especially if it's been a toxic situation where someone has had to leave for a reason that they should not have done, and how that falls out and how that can destroy the community that you've built, and what your goal is to make sure that you can rebuild that. And that's a very, very I think of all the things that happen when somebody leaves camp, that to me is the hardest part, is putting
Yeah.
things back together after someone goes, and to make sure that everybody's still left with dignity and respect. It's a real way to show leadership, I think. Particularly if you have to let someone go, it's the least favorite way to show leadership, I'm sure, for any camp director. But you are still there to show how it's done, how it could be done, how it should be done, and to take care of your people. But I think, as you say, having these things in place ahead of time, even if you never use them, or you don't have to use them for the first 5 years of your career, good on you. But at least knowing how. But I also love that piece that you were talking about bringing, having more people there, so you can think about what happens if that person has to go. There's something, emergency in the family, they injure themselves, something happens, that they need to leave, and how that affects the rest of camp. And I think for most of my career, it was those type of decisions were left to, oh, it's now happened. Now what do we do? And we did often hire extra people to sort of support and be there should we need, somebody sick for the day, or something like that, but never thinking through, what if I have to shut my ropes course down? I'd never done that before, and I think that's really smart, Colette. Because this stuff happens. So just having that opportunity to discuss that with other people and sort of figure it out. You may, of course, have to tweak it in individual circumstances, but
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's where you can create, it's about keeping an open mind too, about that you can create plans, and it's going to be typed in right into like a Google Doc or something. But it's changeable, right? It's not in like super duper Sharpie and you can't ever erase it. It is it's enough of a plan to get you going, knowing that you're gonna have to adapt it along the way based on who that person is, right? Your ropes course versus your aquatics director in a hot place in the summer might, how you respond will be different. So you can't, right, just say this is how we'll handle a whole program area,
Right.
you
Right.
know, because shutting down a whole aquatics program is going to come off very differently to many. You know, we're in the hot Midwest in the summer. Never could I shut that down
Right.
without an uproar,
Yes.
versus a different program area. And then I would add too that like it's also just, this is one of those areas when you're a leader that like it's uncomfortable. You're gonna be uncomfortable. There are going to be, all your staff are going to either voice opinions to you, to your face, or to other people about how you should have handled it differently. And
Right.
that's uncomfortable. And I think, that's something that I've gained more comfort as a leader making those hard decisions and working through those, but it's hard. And it doesn't matter how long I've been doing this, right? Like, when I make an unpopular decision, and maybe that's sometimes, and I say unpopular in that like the feedback I'm getting is that it should have been done differently, but maybe those folks don't have all the information.
Right. Right.
Who is like, how do I learn to sit with that? And how do I learn to like, and what I love what you said about the dignity, how do I also not just be like, this is what I say, so this is how it goes, right? But also be like, okay, how do I help you? How do I help my staff feel comfortable? How do I help my staff through this transition? Um, Even though I might be having a lot of my own feelings about like, we're all doing the best we can out here.
So,
Like,
can I ask you a personal
yeah.
question? How did you get to this place? What was a couple of points on your journey where
Mhm.
um, you are able to think of this as, your employee, it's a transaction, they provide a service, you provide a paycheck. Um, how do you get there from this is my family and how do I let them go?
Yeah.
Where I think that's a lot how camps struggle. A lot of camp directors, it's why we keep people that maybe we shouldn't have, for those reasons. So how did you sort of get, and I don't mean that you sort of go from being a feeling person to I have no feelings, I'm just
Mhm.
being logical, but like what were some pieces on the journey that helped you get there?
Um, so I've definitely, both as from an employee side, been part of very productive transitions, of fellow coworkers, and very toxic transitions.
Hmm.
And I know that I, as a leader, have also been part of both, right? Like, and um, for me, I think I've really got into this place through just really life experience, but also watching. So a great privilege that I have in this position that I hold now is that I talk with so many different types of organizations and camps. And I'm also very passionate about worker justice and worker rights. And so, it's very important to me as an employer to really remember that my employees are workers and they're humans and they have rights. And just because I can doesn't mean I should sometimes,
Hmm.
and to not take advantage of the fact that they need jobs, as a reason. Also, something that I get often is I will get folks say to me like, "Well, we don't do it for the money." And I used to say that as well.
Yep. Yep.
And I used to tell my camp staff that as well. Like, we're not here for the money. And that used to be an interview question, right? And I don't even ask that. Like, I don't even, in when I'm hiring now, like, we don't get into those kind of discussions because it doesn't really matter, in the sense that like the love of your job doesn't pay your bills. And what I noticed happen to just kind of in the world around us, but especially in the camp, is during the pandemic there was a lot of discourse. I remember seeing online like, how dare the people who aren't going to work at camp this summer when we were really struggling, like, you know, I remember seeing a comment of like, I don't know if I can forgive the people that didn't go to work at camp over the
Oh,
summer. And
wow.
I was like,
Okay.
there's nothing like we're humans and we deserve human dignity, and we have our rights to do with what we have. And as employers, and that's what camps are, employers, we have to sell that, like, this is why you should work for us, and understand that it is a two-way transaction. And that to me helps. Like, I think you can live in both. I don't think that it's like, I don't, by living through this idea of like, these are my employees and this is how we've come to this agreement about what I can expect from them, what they can expect from me, doesn't mean I don't see them as a human. I think it has actually helped me, because it also has pushed me as a leader to look past some of this bias that I also know, this toxic bias that I got as a, camp director and nonprofit leader, of like, we do it because we love it. And so I always like to correct people, because I feel very passionate about the work I do. I feel very connected, but my landlord wants cash, not passion, right? And and also, it's okay that my employees say we deserve livable wages, because you
They
know
do.
they do, right? It like,
Yes.
just because I was not afforded a livable wage in my first professional job does not mean that I should then just be like, well, you should just have to put up with it. Um, and then I think with the exchange of that, like, they've helped me become more accountable. It's really about accountability, as managers and leaders and directors, and that can be very scary as well.
Yes, it can.
It can be very scary, because you're like, oh gosh. And that's where sometimes you have to advocate for like, I find myself advocating for my employees in ways, in their workloads or expectations to maybe our board or our community or our members, in ways that I didn't used to, because I'm just like, I'm accountable to them. Like, part of what they've agreed to by working with me is that I'm going to help make sure their workload is manageable. And that means I'm going to be the one that has to be like, nope, we don't have the capacity for that. And I think that when I look back in my experience as a director, it's something that it's not that I live in a land of regret, but I'm like, I wonder sometimes, like, how I would direct very differently in terms of how I would manage my staff,
Oh, me too. Yeah.
and be like, I want to sometimes call up some of them and be like, I'm so sorry. Like, that was not just like, I've done that, where I have come across, like, at conferences, I've come across past directors when I was a game staff, and I've been like, I'm sorry that I was, you know, a 16-year-old. I was 16, but like, I gave them a lot of headaches when I was 16 at camp. And they're like, it's fine. I'm like, no, I want to apologize. And sometimes I want to like do the opposite too, and be like, yeah, I could have handled that better.
And I think that just comes back to your earlier statement that we're all humans. And
Right.
so we learn and we grow. And better to be in this position where, as you have more experience, you see things you would do differently than the other way around.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this podcast today, I want to know what happens if you are the one leaving your job. What are some ways that we can make our leaving productive for ourselves and our organization in those final days as we head out?
So we are going to be digging. So I'm going to do a quick plug for the Women in Camp Summit, happening
Yay.
December 4th to 6th. I know it's a Beth and I are very passionate about it, because we're going to be doing a 2-hour deep dive on this topic. And part of it, the first half is going to be about as an employer, but then the second half is going to be about as an employee. So we'll dig into all of the very specifics, how to's. But as an employee, I would say that my number two, or my two top kind of feedback that I give when I know that people are leaving their jobs, is one, remember that you've had time to think about it. Typically, the employee has the heads up about that they're going to leave, right? Like, you've started looking for a job, right? So the day that you go in to resign, um, it could be a shock to the person you're resigning to. And
Right.
so recognizing that and giving some respect. Now, this, I want to caveat that I'm not talking about true toxic work environments or harassment. Like,
Mm.
You need to get out, you need to get out for personal and mental safety. You should do that. I'm talking about traditional kind of like you're ready to move on to something else. Is that one of the greatest things, gifts you can give yourself is to give some respect to the idea that like you've had time to kind of process this and that it's going to be new information for the person or the team. And so while it might be really, you might want to really quick tell everybody, just be like, okay, I know, like it will go far if you just say, hey, I'm leaving, blah, 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 blah. I know that, you probably didn't wake up this morning thinking that you were going to be dealing with this. I want to help you with this transition. So let me know. And, can we regroup in 24 hours and 48 hours to talk about how that would look? And then you keep that kind of to yourself and to your immediate circle, right? Like, um, because by giving your manager a little bit of space, it's going to make you look really professional and it's going to help create a more pleasant experience for you. The second thing I would say is that when you resign from a job, you're essentially giving up uh, really the need to give any more kind of hard mental labor into helping them sort it out. Like that is the right. It is when I've had employees resign. I'm like, thank you for the information. Let's regroup and work through it. But that like it's now my problem, right, as the employer. And what I see happen and what I hear from especially camp professionals is there is a innate need because we want to help the community is this is how I think it should go. But the reality is it's going to go the way that the organization, the camp, the manager needs it to go. And so let it go that way. Like, let it go. Like, offer yourself up if they've got questions or they ask for your feedback, certainly provide it. But think of those last days as just your way to just kind of clean things up, support them in what they need, and move along, but don't get caught up in they're going to do it wrong. They're not doing it the way I would because like you're leaving. That's, like you've kind of like, what is like you're released from that kind of burden and release it because you should be focusing on celebrating where you're going. And I've seen camp professionals get so hung up on that the manager didn't do it the way that they would have done it and I'm like, but you're just like value the time that you have with those coworkers that you do like, or you
Hmm.
are, close up, leave some nice clean files, clean out your desk, provide the support and focus on this really cool thing that you're transitioning to, as opposed to getting caught up into something that you know, is not really your problem anymore. And that's okay. I think in camp because we're so focused on community and that sense of
Yes.
connection, we can put
Uh-huh.
ourselves into problems and want to solve them. I'm very much like I do that often, and it's something I've been working on for the last couple of years. Like that's not my problem, and it's not in a way of like it's not my problem, turn a blind eye right to like serious things, but just like that's somebody else's responsibility. I need to focus on this, and this is a great time to just do that, to just be like, you know well, how let me know how I can help you with this, um and then take their lead and go with that.
I
And
bet you there are a lot of listeners who needed to hear that particular piece of advice.
yeah, and what happens, your like it's you're not leaving in this very high conflict sort of way. So your coworkers, your manager is like, you might have better opportunities for references from these coworkers and managers because you're not creating a more unintentionally, I would say, creating more of a conflict situation in this big transition. You're just showing that you're a team player. You're showing that you want to support the organization. You're showing that you're professional, even if you've got your own feelings again. So, like, where are you putting your feelings? That shouldn't be coming out in this setting with your coworkers or your employer. Find other solutions and support systems. Um, and then you can like sleep better at night and start your new job and and that person's problem. Like,
I love that. I really do. I really do. All right, we're going to wrap things up, or at least start to today. If you would like to get involved in Camp Code and any of its topics, we would love for you to tell us your thoughts on this episode and any others we have. You can let us know any topics you'd like us to discuss or any guests you recommend that we should have on the show to learn from, and any great leadership training tips you have to share. We would love to hear from you. We are all about sharing in this industry. And if you found this podcast to be useful, please leave us a rating and review for us in your podcasting app, because your feedback helps us to keep the show going. So you can do any of that if you want to. You can email us directly, which we'll talk about momentarily, or you can use social media and use the hashtag CampCode. All right. So this is how you can get in touch with us if you would like to. So Colette, where can they find out more about you?
well, you can find me on LinkedIn under my name. And I'd love to connect with you there, or you can also email me at Colette, COLETTE at ACAIL.org.
Perfect. Thank you. And Colette, can you just spell your last name for us so we can find you on
Yes.
LinkedIn, please?
Marquardt, M as in Mary, ARQUAR, D as in dog, T as in Tom.
This is a lot of consonants at the end there together.
Yes.
So just make sure you spell it correctly if you're looking for Colette. You can email me directly at beth@gocamp.pro. I'm on Instagram at topaz_faye, or on Twitter, I'm still going to call it that, at Topaz, at least for now. Anyway, for our next podcast, we'll be chatting with Matt Wilfred of Campfire Circle and the First Class Counselor podcast about training and working with pretty much an entirely volunteer staff. Our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership training. And again, we would love to hear some of your memorable moments or your most effective tips. And you can tell us what they are using that hashtag CampCode. And of course, this week's best practice is going to come from Colette.
All right. I loved leadership training. It was my favorite part of summer, and it's probably the thing that I miss the most.
Me too.
I would say that my number one tip is that as a director, to always be in the training, and to very much minimize the amount of time you're not in the space, even if other people are leading, but to be actively engaged. I think that it can really demonstrate and role model what you expect, cabin counselor to do when you go to arts, right? That they're in there, that they're engaged. So making sure that you're showing up, even though there's a lot of emails and phone calls coming in. And so I would also say then kind of a sub tip is making sure you're building in your staff training times where you can go do that work without missing, key important pieces of staff training.
Perfect. And this way, you're less likely to have to let somebody go.
Yep.
If you can catch those things early during
Oh,
training
yeah.
and support them in the way that they need. Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Colette. Camp Code is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network, and you can check out all of our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. And this year we are adding a new one called The Pudding, because the proof is in the pudding. And you can join Travis Allison and Dr. Mandy Baker as they share scientific proof to improve our staff recruitment and retention. You'll find The Pudding in the Camp Hacker podcast feed. Thank you so much to Colette for joining us today and for her very wise insight. Every time I sit down and discuss camp or life really with her, I learn more. And it was really a pleasure having you here today. So thanks, Colette. And from all of us here at Camp Code, thanks for the listening, friends.